and happy Saturday. I am KHOU 11 meteorologist Kim Castro based out of Houston, Texas. It is Saturday, September 24th, and we have got your tropical update from the latest advisory from the National Hurricane Center. I am mostly going to be focused on Tropical Storm Ian. However, I will talk about the consequences from what was Major Hurricane Fiona that is now post-tropical Cyclone Fiona. And I want to give you another heads up. During the middle of the forecast, I am bilingual, and so since Tropical Storm Ian is expected to impact several countries and areas that speak Spanish, I will go back and forth between English and Spanish for a section of this forecast in order to make sure I am alerting and warning anybody that perhaps doesn't understand the English portion of this tropical update. All right, let's jump right into it, talking about a very busy Atlantic Basin. We are watching 5 different areas. Like I mentioned, I'm going to pay particular attention to Tropical Storm Ian and post-tropical Cyclone Fiona. There are 3 other areas that we are watching. Tropical Storm Hermine, that has had rain impacts along the west coast of Africa. Similar story for Tropical Storm Gaston, which is now expected to become a fish storm. And then this area has a 30% chance for development over the next 5 days in the central Atlantic. No threat to land as of now. So we will continue by talking about the impacts that the eastern coastline of Canada has had with what was Major Hurricane Fiona. We saw some recorded areas with the potential of gusts up to 140 miles an hour on impact. Right now, currently, Fiona has sustained maximum winds at 80 miles an hour. Forward motion is to the north at 25 miles an hour, and so the areas that are on this northeast quadrant of this storm could potentially still see some wind gusts of about 100 or so miles an hour. So that still means hurricane force wind impacts as this storm continues to pass. Remember, this got enveloped by an area of low pressure, and that's why it dropped down its category from hurricane status, which has a warm core, to now transitioning to post-tropical characteristics, which encompasses more cold core features. This is what it looks like on a wider view. Its range and reach is expansive. Not only are we talking about the wind field here, but we're talking about major heavy downpour, storm surge impacts too. Rain from this system anywhere between 3 to 6 inches area wide. A couple of isolated spots could potentially wind up with 13 inches of rain, unprecedented for this area of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. This type of system with this much strength hasn't gotten this far up in latitude since Major Hurricane Debbie in 1982, which was a Category 4 storm. Now, talking about rain impacts when it comes to Tropical Storm Ian, we've got to get started on that already this weekend and into the start of this coming work week. So I'm going to talk about what sort of impacts we can see first. The area is expected to be impacted by the close passage of this storm here today, tomorrow, and into the start of the work week. So for Jamaica, Kingston area could potentially see the majority of the expected rainfall. The storm, I'll show you the track here in a minute, is going to be a little bit further towards the west, and so impacts won't be as substantial as perhaps the Cayman Islands, and especially as we go into Cuba, which I'll show you here in a minute. So Cayman Islands, anywhere between 4 to potentially 5 inches of rain expected this weekend. Of course, isolated areas could see more substantial totals as we take you forward through time. Here's Tuesday morning. Now we're looking at impacts in Cuba, especially for the Havana area, potentially 4 to 7 inches of rain. Entonces les voy a platicar ahora en español porque yo sé que varios de ustedes que nos están viendo desde Cuba quizás necesitan que les explique qué va a pasar este fin de semana ahora en español. Tenemos ese sistema tropical Ian que se ha formado y va a pasar muy cerca de ustedes este fin de semana. Con este sistema, lo que nos amenaza son esas lluvias bien fuertes que pueden causar cuestiones de inundación y también unos riesgos con esas ráfagas de viento muy fuerte. Entonces tengan mucho cuidado y prepárense bien, especialmente si se fijan en esa área de Havana, pueden ver que tenemos el potencial de ver desde 4 hasta 6 pulgadas de lluvia. Es muy posible que vemos mucho más de esto. Ahorita solamente nos estamos viendo los modelos, que lo que estamos anticipando. La área de Santa Fe quizás podrá ver entre 5 a 7, quizás algunas áreas aquí en amarillo, quizás puedan ver hasta 10 o 12 pulgadas de lluvia. What I just said in Spanish, some of these areas, these are forecasted rainfall totals, could see between 4 to 10 inches of rain. Some isolated areas could see more substantial totals with this type of rainfall, especially with the terrain. We could certainly see the risk for flash flooding and even mudslides. In addition to that, they'll be dealing with a very difficult wind field situation, which I'll break down in a moment too. Then as we head into the start of the work week, the exact track of Tropical Storm Ian hasn't exactly been determined. We're still looking at that launch pad, the starting point where the center of circulation is going to take off and take flight, and of course, where it will be steered to. But for now, models are wanting to favor the Keys and the southernmost portion of Florida for where we could see those first rain impacts as Ian continues to make its push north and to the northeast. Here is a look at Tropical Storm Ian on infrared satellite imagery. Lots of convection on both sides of the circulation. We are seeing more favorable conditions now. As we move forward over the next couple of days, we will see that Ian is going to move into an area that will not inhibit its growth. And I'll talk about why that is in a moment. But for right now, maximum sustained winds, 45 miles an hour, continues its move towards the west. Moving a little bit quickly. If it slows down, it's going to be able to collect a lot more of that warm water resource that it will certainly be meeting up with here momentarily. Pressures have remained steady from the last update we got earlier this morning, but pressure falls continue from what we saw last night, and we'll expect that to continue to intensify as we go into this afternoon's advisory. Now here's a look at visible satellite imagery. Again, you could see the bright whites, some overshooting cloud tops. The storm is definitely starting to grow, and we'll continue to see it do that. And you'll notice something else that I'm focused on here on visible satellite imagery is the disruption value. So are we seeing wind that is coming in different directions from the north and the east, disrupting the overall construction and the overall cyclonic rotation of the storm? If so, that's what would slow it down. However, we're not seeing a whole lot of that anymore, and we're expecting to see much less of it. This is a forecast of wind shear favorability. So the areas that you see here in bright pink, bright red, orange, and yellow, these areas signify that conditions are going to be very tranquil. They're going to be favorable for Tropical Storm Ian to not be interrupted and to continue to grow. Now the areas here that you see are clear. These signify areas that still have some stronger wind, and that's what's kept Ian a little bit capped, so to speak, why the growth hasn't taken flight just yet. But with these favorable conditions in the area where Ian is traveling towards the west, with this being much more calm, in fact, there's a weak area of high pressure that's going to act as a barrier, as a shield, as a block in order for Ian to continue to build and be uninterrupted. Not only that, as it continues its movement towards the west, we're also seeing very favorable conditions when it comes to the sea surface temperatures. Not only a shallow layer, but at a depth, very warm fuels, warm water resources that Tropical Storm Ian will be able to tap into, especially once it gets that vorticity component. So the uplift component, once it's able to really suction off and cut off that circulation, define it, it will be able to put a bullseye in all of these warm water areas and absorb the moisture to continue to grow. And that's why we are expecting this storm to undergo some rapid intensification. It's expected to increase in intensity here rather quickly. So let me show you the timeline of when it will go from a tropical storm to a Category 1 hurricane. So the timeline is going to be somewhere around Sunday afternoon into Sunday evening. As it's passing through Jamaica, getting close to the Cayman Islands, that's when we expect it to transition to a Category 1 hurricane. Now, notice I showed you that rain impacts for Jamaica weren't as substantial as the ones for the Cayman Islands, and the reason for that, well, the track of the storm is going to stay a healthy distance away from Jamaica, but notice it gets much closer to the Cayman Islands. Not only that, it's on the dirty side, the unfavorable side of the storm. The reason why it's unfavorable, on this northern side, the northwest quadrant, the southwest quadrant, the storm gains momentum and intensity, and this wraparound moisture allows for the area that's on the east side of the storm to get hit with the strongest winds and the most torrential rain. And as it gets even closer to the Cayman Islands by, say, Monday morning, early on, not only do we have hurricane strength, we now have Category 2 hurricane strength, potentially becoming a major Category 3 hurricane by early Tuesday morning as it's headed closer and closer towards Havana. Now we're seeing Cuba under the cone of uncertainty and the impacts from what is right now Tropical Storm Ian, and expected to potentially get very close to the Panhandle as a major hurricane still. The Keys will be under the watchful eye of the National Hurricane Center and meteorologists all across the nation, across the world even, because these types of impacts certainly draw concern for storm surge, for flash flooding, torrential rainfall, and very strong wind impacts. 120 miles an hour is the intensity that Ian is expected to accumulate as we head into the middle of next week. Now notice this cone of uncertainty certainly widens as we head into the latter part of the forecast into next week. And the reason for that, there's still quite a bit of uncertainty as to where Ian will move to exactly. There are a couple of different factors at play, mainly the upper level steering winds, that will really determine where Ian shifts. And it's not out of the question, even though the cone still remains in Florida and stretches to the Panhandle, not out of the question that we could see the northeastern upper Texas Gulf Coast under the impacts, or the potential to see the cone shift a little bit. Let's talk about wind impacts and the timing of those first. Like I mentioned, Jamaica not expected to see too much of the wind or torrential downpour impacts, about a 20 to 30% because of the proximity or lack thereof from Tropical Storm Ian. Cayman Islands certainly seeing a more favorable possibility for those strong wind gusts, and Havana under that bullseye of very likely to see strong impacts from not just tropical storm, but hurricane force impacts there. Key West seeing that potential too, and the main swath of possibility really remains close to the state of Florida, the Keys, and Cuba. For right now, given the location of Ian, we've got two areas that we're watching. Jamaica Tropical Storm Watch for tropical storm impacts. Those reduced winds still impactful and definitely seeing impactful rain, but more so for the Cayman Islands, which is why we have a hurricane watch there. Hurricane force winds possible. Torrential rain of hurricane status possible there as well. Okay, I talked to you about the uncertainty when it comes to the path. Well, check this out. This is the GFS, the American model. What we're seeing here, the same thing we're going to see in the European model as far as the main features that are at play, but how much they'll influence the storm is a little bit different. So high pressure over the state of Texas, moving to the west. Both models agree on that. A low pressure area with a trough going to be digging in. Both models agree on that. But notice the GFS, and I'll show you the European here in a minute so you can make the comparison, has this trough not digging quite as low. So this front associated with it will nudge the tropical storm, the hurricane at that point, towards the east, but potentially not as far as we thought. It could scoot a little bit more towards the west, and it could stay there a little bit longer if it doesn't have enough of a pull and enough of an influence from the trough. Now notice the American model, the European rather, that should say the European model. Right here, this trough digs in further, and you'll notice where the center of circulation is over Florida. So if we do get this scenario to pop up, this trough to dig in further south and in fact usher in a secondary trough that could scoop up Ian and push it towards the East Coast more so than what the American model is currently showing. So we'll just have to watch those currents closely, and here's the comparison between the two. In red, we have the European model, and in yellow, we have the American model. Notice both fairly in consensus when it comes to this weekend. A little bit far removed from Jamaica, getting closer to the Cayman Islands. Now, once we get to Cuba, this is Monday time frame now, they start to edge away from each other. The European hugs Cuba a little bit more. The GFS, the American, tends to take it a little bit further west. And now we're in the middle of the week. And now we see the impacts. Does the trough dig deep enough to scoot tropical system Ian, it's storm now, but a hurricane later, does it push it towards the panhandle, or does it push it towards the peninsula? Now the GFS wants to push it more so towards the panhandle. Perhaps it could even nudge it a little bit further west. They're not so far apart from one another, but this is why we have to pay close attention to the forecast and to see how Ian progresses and what the upper level winds are doing. It will have all the difference into which areas go from monitor to forecast to most likely to have impacts. For now, we remain under the most likely to have impacts category for Florida as well as for Cuba for the Cayman Islands. Cancun could potentially be in the mix with that as well, especially if we are looking at the GFS. All right, here is a rundown of where we are so far for the season. We have checked off just this last couple of days, Hermine and Ian. Remember, Ian likely to become a Category 1 hurricane as we round off the weekend. My name is Kim Castro. I'm a meteorologist again from Houston, Texas. You can find me on social media. I have Twitter, I have Instagram, and I have Facebook. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me and ask me on there, especially if you speak Spanish and I didn't get to communicate enough with you. I would love to be able to do that on there. Until next time, please stay weather smart and stay safe.